you can even "Hey You" works a lot of times. So thank you, Taylor, for hostessing us this morning. I want to also thank Luke. I want to thank Kirsten Howe, who helped put this together. And I also want to thank Matt Griffiths, who asked me to contribute an article for the latest issue of the Vermilion Flycatcher on moths. So I want to thank all of them. And so today we're going to talk about moths. Now, I know Tucson Audubon is a bird-related organization. Moths have wings too, at least most of them do. So they kind of fit in nicely. So this is going to be sort of a general introduction to the world of moths. Moths are, I titled it Diverse, Fantastic, and Convenient because there are a lot of moths out there. Birds, there's, depending on who you talk to, we'll say between 10,000 and 11,000 species of bird in the world. There are families of moths that have double that number of species in them. There's nocturnal moths. That's what most of them are. There's diurnal moths, those that are active during the daytime. There's moths that apparently never sleep and are active both day and night. There's some that are carnivores as caterpillars. Most of them are herbivores. Some feed on lichens, fungi, all aquatic plants. There are some that live in the fur of sloths, but are not parasites. There's some in Asia that drink birds' tears. There are some that are the size of dinner plates, and there are others that are barely visible with the naked eye. So a lot of diversity, and many of them are incredibly beautiful, either in their sort of outright colors, often butterfly-like in terms of their colors. Some of them have these amazing patterns on them that when you see them like on your wall of your house, they look really obvious. But if that same moth were perched on a tree trunk, it would be nearly invisible. There are some moths that have very cryptic forewings, but then really brightly colored hind wings. And entomologists believe that the moths use those to sort of startle predators and give moths a chance to get away. And they're convenient. You don't have to go anywhere. No matter where you are in the world, okay, maybe not on the open sea, but if you're on land, there's probably moths nearby, and they're very easy to attract and to look at, and they're just fantastic. I got into moths. I grew up in New England. I got into moths in the early 2000s. I went to, there's a sister organization in a way to Tucson Audubon called the Southeast Arizona Butterfly Association. And we had a field trip down to Peña Blanca Canyon down near Nogales. And our leader on that trip was a gentleman named Bruce Walsh, who's at the University of Arizona. And he put a couple blacklight sheets up, and I was dumbstruck by how many moths we had. It was just absolutely incredible. And that was sort of the spark that got me really interested in moths. And so we have a sister event coming up this Saturday night at the Mason Center from 7:30 until 9:30. And there are also going to be 2 moth trips during the festival in August. Both are going to be at Sabino Canyon. So this is going to be sort of a presentation on them, but we'll have a chance, if you're interested, to actually get out and look at these beautiful creatures in the field. So what is a moth? Well, moths, like butterflies, are members of the insect order Lepidoptera, which basically comes from Greek words that mean scale-winged. And that refers to the tiny little scales that sort of sit on the wings like shingles on the roof. And those scales are what gives butterflies and moths their colors and patterns. They really don't have anything to do with flight. So if they come off, it's not a big deal. They undergo what's called complete metamorphosis, 4 distinct stages in the life cycle: egg, larva, which are often called caterpillars, pupa, and then the adult. And the egg and larval stage, those are kind of the growth stages of the insect. The pupa is that miraculous transitional stage from the worm-like caterpillar to the winged adult. And then the adult stage is basically the reproductive and dispersal stage. If you see a small moth or a small butterfly for that matter, that's exactly what it is. It's just a small butterfly. Once they become adults, they are never going to get any bigger than they are. And the same holds true for moths. The mouth parts, just again as in butterflies, are basically two halves that sort of zip together to form a straw. But since straw is not a very technical term, they're often called the proboscis. And butterflies and moths use the proboscis to sip nectar, to sip water, to sip other fluids. They only take in liquid foods for the most part. There are some very primitive moths that have chewing mouth parts, but those are ancient and not readily seen by most people. Some moths, though, as adults, do not have any mouth parts and cannot feed as adults. So their lifespan is a week or two before they run through the resources that have carried through the pupation stage from the larva. The antenna on insects sort of functions like our noses. They're basically filled with chemoreceptors that help them find mates, help them find food sources, help them find food plants for the caterpillars. And on moths, the antenna either look like a feather, another connection with Audubon, or they look like a thread sticking out of the head. Whereas on a butterfly, they look kind of like a Q-tip. So they have a relatively narrow stalk, and then it kind of gets expanded at the tip. Most, but not all moths are nocturnal. That's common knowledge, moths to a flame and all that. But there are a fair number of species that actually fly during the daytime, and many of them will visit flowers. And some of them are brightly colored, so they can pass themselves off as butterflies. So when you're out there in the field, being in the field could be your garden, or it could be on a hike somewhere, and you're seeing a bunch of insects at flowers, keep in mind that there could be moths there, because not all of them are nocturnal. And they're very diverse in the number of species. We'll talk about this a little bit coming up. They outnumber butterflies at least 8 to 1, probably more like 10 or 12 to 1 in terms of number of species. So for every butterfly species, you're going to have a whole bunch of moth species. And like I said, some of them are actually very brightly colored. The painted tiger moth belongs to a group that are they're kind of the rock stars of the moth world, just because they are brightly colored or very interestingly patterned, many of them, but not all of them. And as such, because our eyes are really good at picking up colors, and we're fascinated by the shiny baubles, which is partly explains why people like warblers and tanagers so much. They like these moths for the same reason. They're very brightly colored. And this is a moth that we get in the oak woodlands of the Sky Island ranges. So a little bit above the valley floors, but not too high up. So I mentioned it's hard to distinguish sometimes between a moth or a butterfly. You cannot use color. There are some very drab butterflies, and there are some shockingly beautiful moths. And you can't use time of flight either, because, like I've already mentioned, there are some moths that fly during the daytime. I personally think the easiest way is to look at the antenna. So on the left there, you see a female black witch, which is an absolutely wonderful name for a moth, a black witch. But you can see the the thread-like antenna there. The animal on the right is a veined tenuca, and you can see that its antennae look like feathers. So those are both moths. The one in the center is a butterfly. It's a butterfly called the Nyssa roadside skipper. And you can see the antennae are kind of short. No, they're not always this short, but you can see they kind of get expanded at the tip. So I think a look at the head is usually a good way to separate a moth from a butterfly. Moths generally tend to be more robust in their body than butterflies are, but there's a big family of moths where their bodies look very butterfly-like in their proportions. So the antennae are usually the best. The one thing I will say, I mentioned that there are some moths that fly during the daytime. In North America anyway, the opposite is rarely true. meaning when we set up black lights, we rarely get butterflies attracted to them. So if you turn your patio lights and you have a moth, what you think is a moth or a butterfly show up, it's very, very likely it's going to be a moth, because butterflies generally are asleep by then and are not attracted to the lights. I wanted to touch briefly on some, because for every adult moth you see, those are the lucky ones, because they were the ones that were able to avoid predators, avoid parasites, avoid harsh climatic conditions to survive to adulthood. So those are the lucky ones. But to get to that, you have to go through the larval stage. And in my opinion, many of the caterpillars are just as worthy of our interest as birds or butterflies or dragonflies or the adult moths, because they're absolutely spectacular. So to give you a sense, this was up in Molino Vista Overlook a few years ago. This is a caterpillar on wild cotton. And to give you a size reference, this would fit comfortably into a hot dog bun. That's how this thing is about 5 inches long. I wouldn't want to eat it because it's very spiky, but caterpillars are essentially eating machines, walking stomachs, if you will. And their main job is to eat as much as they can, as quickly as they can. And while doing that, not get eaten by something else in the process. The head, by the way, is at the left end. So here's like the head right here. Here are the thoracic legs, and then you have the tail end down here. These ovals, those are the spiracles. Those connect to the breathing system of the caterpillar. I just want to point out that the whole thing with metamorphosis, to go from this to an adult, is pretty darn astonishing. And it's incredible because any insect, which includes beetles and ants and bees and wasps and flies and a whole bunch of other insects, they're basically two insects in the same species. So the adult is very different from the larvae, but the genetics is all the same. It's just remarkable to me. Here's another one, the Carolina Sphinx. The Sphinx, again, the head is to the left. The Sphinx moths, especially some of the members in the genus Manduca, if you've ever had a tomato plant in your garden and it's doing great, and you come out in the next morning and there's not a single leaf left on it, that's a close cousin to this one, the 5-spotted Sphinx. These guys will eat tomato plants as well. But remember, they're walking stomachs. And so I know people who will actually plant tomato plants in their moth garden purely so that the caterpillars will feed on them. And if they get defoliated, it's not that big of a deal. This is that transitional stage. Now, the silk moths, or also sometimes called the Saturniid moths or the wild silk moths, they're kind of famous for making these silken cocoons. So the pupa is actually inside of this cocoon. Many species like Glover's silk moth will actually take little bits of leaf fragments and lichens and dead leaves to weave into the cocoon to make it less visible to potential predators. And in many, not all, but many of the insects, the harsh time of the year is spent in this stage, the pupa. So like I grew up in New England, and like I said, and the winter was when you would see the pupa around. Here it's both the winter and the dry season. We're coming up on the hot, dry time of the year. And so during that time, there's often a little bit of a dip in terms of not only bird activity, but insect activity as well, because everything's just trying to get through until the monsoon starts. So here, as well as in the tropics, is kind of the dry season, which is the harsh time of year. But anyway, in many of the North American species, the winter or the dry season is spent as a pupa. Sphinx moths, this is that white-lined sphinx that were really abundant a couple of years ago. These ones, basically, the caterpillar digs a cell, basically, in the soil and then pupates in there. It doesn't form a cocoon. And here you can see that, you got the wings developing right here. These are going to be the wings. Here's the eye. This is going to be the abdomen down here. And so if you're doing landscaping, like you're digging a hole to put a new plant in the ground, you might encounter a sphinx moth pupa, because that's generally what they do. I kind of like keep things sort of lighthearted, but someone sent me this cartoon and I thought it was hilarious. This is some entomology humor. Gary Larson from The Far Side. I think he was an entomologist at heart. He does a lot of these, but I don't think this is his. So the classification, like I said, moths are in the order Lepidoptera. There's about 130 families of moths. There's a lot of them. The number of species varies widely depending on who you talk to, which reference you consult, which website you go to. Whatever the number you see, it's usually between 160,000 and 180,000 species. Whatever the number is, it's going to go up because new species are being described on a regular basis. Of that total, it's about 13,000 members of the order Lepidoptera in North America, 94% of which are moths. And in the western half of North America, so basically the front range of the Rockies to the Pacific coast, there are 8,000 species. In Arizona, in southern Arizona alone, we have about 2,000. And again, new species in southern Arizona are being described on a yearly basis. I know in the last 5 years, there's been a half a dozen or so, at least, species new to science described in southern Arizona. So we are far from completing our inventory of the moths of the world, never mind North America and Arizona. Historically, because of all that, the chaos created by the number of species, entomologists have kind of divided the Lepidoptera into the microlepidoptera and the macrolepidoptera, or micros and macros for short. And that utility is kind of falling out of favor, it seems like, nowadays, but it is useful because it does help, again, make sense of the chaos, but it's not very efficient because there are many micros that are bigger than many macros. So again, common names, right? We have a hard time with common names. Olive warbler, it's neither one, but that's what we call the thing. However, the microlepidoptera are more ancient. They are, if you look at the order Lepidoptera as a branch on the tree of life, then the micros are going to be closer to the trunk, and the macros are going to be out more near the tip of the branch. So in that sense, it still makes sense, but the whole size thing implied by those names is not all that efficient. So this is an abbreviated family tree. I have another diagram. It's just lines going everywhere, and it would just give everybody a headache. So I went with this more simple one. So at the top there, those are the micros. The closest living relative of butterflies and moths are caddisflies, insects that have hairs on the wings instead of scales, and their larvae are aquatic, so they're usually found near water. So the top half of this diagram is a handful of the families of microlepidoptera. The bottom half is the macrolepidoptera, and you'll notice right in the middle, surrounded by a dotted line, are the blue ones. Those are the butterflies. And so butterflies they're really not that different from moths. Our attitudes towards them is quite different, but they're not special in an evolutionary sense. They are basically a group of day-flying, often brightly colored moths, because if you look, there's moths both above them in evolutionary time and below them. So they're just a sort of spectacular offshoot that we like a lot, mainly because they, generally speaking, don't eat our crops, they don't eat our sweaters, all that sort of stuff. Moths, on the other hand, some of them, a very small minority of them, have some habits that we wish they wouldn't do. So again, butterflies are not the very end of the branch. They're not like the pinnacle of the evolution of this group. They're just a branch along that big branch that they all have sprouted off of. So we're going to cover a few of the micros. If you wanted to get into mothing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I think it is not a bad idea to sort of skip these guys in the beginning, just because there's a lot of them and they're quite small, and many of them, not all of them, and they can be really hard to identify. But some of them, that's not the case. Some of them are pretty easy to identify. Like I said, the name, there are some micros that are bigger than some of the macros, which is just wonderful. And it is more accurate, instead of the size reference, to think of these as more ancient than the macros. So they've been around a lot longer. They were, these micros, some of these micros evolved before the flowering plants did. So they were able to utilize things like conifers and ferns, and they were doing just fine, thank you very much. And then the flowering plants appeared, and the planet went bananas when that happened. But they're more ancient. I don't like another word you often hear when describing the micros is that they are more primitive. I don't personally like that word because it sort of implies to me that they're somehow inferior to everything else, which they're not. So I like to use the term more ancient. They're also extraordinarily diverse in terms of their lifestyles. So they have if a caterpillar can do it, there's probably a micro caterpillar doing it. They're fascinating in their own right, without a doubt. But again, from identification standpoint, they're a challenge for sure. And because of that, they're frequently understudied or overlooked when it comes to like biological surveys, like a BioBlitz or something like that, unless you get specialists for the micros. And then those folks can usually pretty reliably identify every one of them, but for the average Joe, it's a little bit more of a challenge. So we're going to focus on a couple of the early, easier ones. So this little guy, this was again Madera Canyon. Madera Canyon is a great spot to go mothing in southern Arizona. Wingspan on this guy was probably 3/4 of an inch. They show up on the sheet and they're very easy to identify. Those very dark wings with the white spots makes them quite distinct, quite conspicuous. As is this guy. I will say here, before we get too far in, that most moths do not have common names. There are people. So in the last handful of years, 2 field guides for moths have come out in the Peterson Field Guide series by the same people, David Beadle, who's in Canada, and Seabrook Leckie. There's one for northeastern North America and one for southeastern North America. And part of the reason I think why moths have not gotten their due in terms of watchable wildlife is the fact they don't have common names. I think, when dragonflies, when field guides started to appear, the modern field guide for dragonflies around the late 90s, early 2000s, they made that group of insects readily accessible to the general public. And now dragonflies, there's dragonfly societies, and there's dragonfly walks and dragonfly festivals even. So I think the same is going to happen with moths. It's just, it's just going to take time. So as of right now, there most of the moths, some of the moths we're going to talk about do not have common names. And if you can try to pronounce the names or not, it's up to you. If you pronounce it, I had a friend of mine who's a herpetologist, and he says, if I hear someone pronounce a scientific name, I'll pronounce it a different way because we have an equal chance of pronouncing it correctly. And no one's gonna argue with you. Anyway, I've heard sort of through the rumor mill that team is working on a Western field guide, but I don't know where that stands. In which case, we won't have to worry about this because they're going to coin common names for all the ones they include in the book. Here's another one, the mesquite stinger moth. Now, this is a very common one. This one's nice because it's a moth. That's a plus. Its caterpillars feed on mesquite trees, among others, and the stinger part refers to the caterpillars. They have spines on them that can sting. The caterpillar of the splendid royal moth that I showed earlier, it's got big horns on it. They cannot sting, but the caterpillars of this can. And they can be quite abundant. If you have mesquites in your yard, once we get into the monsoon season, you might get a couple of dozen of these show up at your patio lights in an evening. Lengthwise, these total length on these, again, about 3/4 of an inch from the top to the bottom. The yucca moth. So this is another small moth that the females usually don't come to lights. The males will occasionally come to lights. This photo was taken actually looking into a soap tree yucca flower. Yucca moths are the only pollinators of yucca plants. And the females have modified mouth parts that basically make a ball of pollen that they then sort of slam dunk on the stigma, which is the pollen receptacle, the part of the female part of the flower. And that pollinates the plant, and that's great. The yucca really is appreciative of that, but the yucca moth will then lay eggs into the like the ovary basically of the flower, and that's because her caterpillars are going to feed on some of the developing seeds. So this is a classic example of what's called a mutualism, a system where both parties benefit. And if we were to lose either, in this case, the soap tree yucca, we would also lose this moth, and vice versa is also true. There's about 20 species of yucca in North America, and most of them only have a single moth. That is its pollinator. Joshua tree, sort of to our northwest, it actually has 2 yucca moths that will pollinate it, but the 2 moths don't overlap in range. In fact, the one in the eastern part of the Mojave was described fairly recently as a brand new species. And so a very tight relationship between the insect and their plants. These things, the Ceciidae are called the clear-wing moths because in most cases, the scales are largely off, except along the edges of the wing, and they're extremely good wasp mimics. It's one of those things that if you start to reach for one, your brain is kind of screaming at you, "No, you idiot, that thing's going to make you hurt." But they have the tubular mouth parts, whereas wasps actually have chewing mouth parts. This is a fairly rare species. This photo was taken by a colleague of mine. We were on a butterfly trip actually up to Incinerator Ridge on Mount Lemmon, and there was a lot of ceanothus in flower, and we happened to come across this moth. So they don't come to lights. Many of them are active during the daytime. Some of them will feed on members of the squash family as caterpillars, and they do occasionally become pests. Like if you had a squash or watermelon or pumpkin field, they could do a little bit of damage to them. But a day-flying moth that looks a lot like a wasp, and the mimicry is so good that unless you're trying to peered in for a closer look, you may not be able to tell the two apart. We have one of these is a wasp, and one of these is a moth, and one of these is a beetle. The one on the left is a beetle. The one on the right was up at Middle Bear Picnic Area on Mount Lemmon. Again, a day-flying wasp, day-flying moth. And so the beetle on the left, it is chemically protected, and the moth on the right is a mimic of it. I mean, the antennae are different. There's not quite as much of the black on the wingtips compared to the beetle. But when it comes to mimicry, you don't have to be 100% accurate. You just have to be close enough. And it's quite possible that the moth is also chemically protected because it belongs to a family called the Zygaenidae, which is sometimes called the Burnet moths or the smoky moths, and many of them are toxic. And so this might be an example of what's called Mullerian mimicry, where 2 unpalatable things mimic each other, and that increases the learning curve of potential predators, in this case, mostly birds and lizards. The plume moths, now these are pretty easy to recognize as the right family, the Pterophoridae. They look sort of like the letter T. They actually have, most insects most insects have wings, and there's usually two pairs of wings, the forewings and the hind wings. When you look at these things, it kind of looks like they only have one pair, and that's because they kind of compact the hind and forewings together on each side. So they're actually four wings there. It just looks like they're two. So they're easy to identify to the family level, but a challenge to identify to species. And its recent genetic evidence indicates that the plume moths, this family, are the closest relatives to the butterflies, even though when you look at the two, that connection, that relationship may not jump out at you, but that based on the genetics, that does seem to be the case. And then we get to the macros. These are probably the moths that most people think about when it comes to moths. So like, all right, now we got some stuff we can sink our teeth into. They are more recent in origin. Many of these sort of evolved around the time of the flowering plants, over 100 million years ago. It includes some of the largest families in the entire order. So there's a family called the inchworm moths, or the looper moths, the family Geometridae. That family alone has 23,000 species in it. The next two, Noctuidae and Erebidae, they used to be in the same family together, but they were split apart about a decade ago. But both of those have 20,000 plus species in them. Again, these three families all likely have double the number of bird species in the world, just these three families. And I don't remember how many families of birds there are, a lot. But these are just three families. So if you see an insect, a moth, show up at your patio lights, and you want to impress your friends who are over for cocktails, you could say, well, that thing is probably one of three species, a member of one of three families, and you have a pretty good chance of being right, because just the diversity in these families. However, even though they are more diverse in terms of number of species than the micros, the macros have a relatively boring, if you will, life history. Some of them, most of them feed on leaves of plants. Some of them feed on petals. Some of them feed on fungus or lichens and things like that. But they don't approach the lifestyle differences that we see in the micros. So this guy kind of, I like this guy. Very sleepy moth. So these are members of the family Lasiocampidae. This also includes the tent caterpillar moths, which you might be familiar with. If you go to anywhere where there's cottonwoods right now, or willows, you'll see these silken tents on the foliage. That's the tent caterpillars, and that's the same family of these guys. But they have very, very hairy bodies. They have a very hairy head. They look like an 80s metal band singer who's 75 years old now, and the hair is all white. They have this patch of metallic blue-black scales on the thorax, but they have these really delicately colored gray, black, and white wings. I think they're absolutely fantastic. When I say sleepy, so these will show up at your patio lights, and they might stick around for 2 or 3 days and not move at all. That's just what they do. The tent caterpillars are usually a bit more active than that, the tent caterpillar moths. So this is a really cool moth, easy to attract to your lights. We'll often get a spring generation, so March and April, and then another generation during the summer months. The sphinx moths, also called hawk moths, are very fast flyers. This one is obviously during the daytime at a thistle flower. You can see the pink and black hind wings. Normally when we see these guys, they look like this. And if you've seen a sphinx moth in Arizona before, it could very well be this one, because it's the most common one we have. And when I mentioned earlier that sometimes their caterpillars reach huge densities, and you can see armies of them crossing the road and such. And they'll eat just about anything. There's this sort of rumor out there, like when you learned, at least I learned in school, is that butterflies and moths are very specific about where they'll lay their eggs, because the caterpillars will only feed on one plant or one family of plants. And that is indeed often true. However, that's not always the case. And I kind of think of white-lined sphinx moths as like a hungry teenage boy. You put almost anything in front of them, and down it will go. But they're quite common. You can see them flying around dusk, visiting your flowers, or early in the morning, sometimes even in the middle of the day. If you have plants that are attracting butterflies during the day, there's very likely moths coming to them at night. And so you can just go out with like a flashlight and look on the flowers to see if you see any. Of course, sometimes just walking out there with a flashlight might scare them off, but that's another way you can look at moths. The rustic sphinx, this one feeds a lot on desert willow. Another very distinctive, very bold black and white pattern with those white spots surrounded in a black field. Those white spots are called the reniform spot because they're often sort of kidney shaped. This is not as common as the white line sphinx, but it's bigger. This thing, so to give you a size reference, from the top of the head to the end of the wings, we're talking probably 3.5 inches or so. So this is a pretty hefty sized moth, but pretty easy one to identify if you happen to see one. The small-eyed sphinx, this was that night in Peña Blanca Canyon with Bruce Walsh back in the early 2000s. So this one kind of is a dead leaf mimic. The wings are kind of irregular in shape. They're kind of a rich sort of rusty brown color with black highlights. Now the eyes are actually normal sized. The small-eyed part of the name comes from the fact on the hind wings, this species has eye spots, and the eye spots are believed to startle predators when they're suddenly exposed, and that's what the name applies to. It's smaller on this species than on some of the other ones. Not the actual eyes, you can see that white one reflecting the light are actually normal size. Many moths have pretty big eyes for their size. The wild silk moths, the Saturniidae. So this is the group, like if you're from back east, the Luna moth, this beautiful, big pastel green creature that is almost otherworldly, is a member of this family. The Cecropia moth, another big, rusty and red species, is in this family. The Western imperial moth is one of our more common species, quite variable in color. Some are sort of a reddish, more reddish than this one. This one's quite yellow. But again, you can see the 4 eye spots, one on each wing. So we got one here, that's the forewing. Here's the dividing line between the wings right here. So this is the forewing, this is the hind wing. Hind wing comes here, here's the body. Here's the other hind wing, and here's the line between the hind wing, right hind wing and right forewing, and they have the eye spots. Now, just when it gets dark, it's not like all the moths go, oh, we're awake, let's go out now. It doesn't happen that way. There's sort of shifts that happen. Some of them will come out around dusk and fly around. Many of the silk moths are sort of late risers, meaning that their peak of their activity is usually in the small hours of the morning. This photo is in Madera Canyon. A few years ago, we actually kind of got lucky because this guy showed up about 10 p.m. It wasn't all that late, but many of these things will not fly until after midnight, between like midnight and 4 a.m. This one you may have seen before. Hubbard's small silk moth feeds on mesquite as a caterpillar. They normally sit like the left slide, sort of their wings folded up. However, if you gently touch them, they may open those hind wings or open those forewings to show the hind wings, which are red with a black spot in the middle. Again, the theory is that something looks black and all of a sudden it sees red with what might be eyes looking back at it. The predator might leave, or it might pause long enough for the insect to fly away. So these guys are about, they're actually the small silk part of their name is true, because they're one of the smaller silk moths. So their body length is probably 1.5 inches or so, wingspan probably more like 2.5 inches, but can be quite common. Very, very sort of sublimely beautiful insects. The Aculea moth, this is similar to a species that's, again, the east, that's called the Polyphemus moth. That's a much warmer brown color. This one's kind of dark because it's got a lot of black, what's called overscaling. So like a black dust of scales on the wings. Again, has the big eye spots on the wing. I think if you look at if you look from, get my cursor, from like here down, it looks like 2 eyes and a mustache. And again, this is for not really camouflage, but potential predator avoidance mechanism. You can see the big feathery antenna on this one. The antenna on a lot of moths are very acutely attuned to female pheromones. And so they've done studies where males of certain moths, I think the study was done in Asia, where they found a male find a female from like 7 miles away by detecting these pheromones. It was able to fly. Usually, they're coming from a much closer distance, but they can come from quite a ways away. The geometers, this is that 23,000 plus family. The geometers are often sort of somberly colored. Maybe, they're big fans of earth tones. But again, when they're on the wall, they kind of stick out. But if you were to try to find this thing on the ground amongst the rocks, it would blend in really well. This is a very common species, flies almost all year, but it's kind of variable. Many of the individuals are much more gray overall, not as dark as this one, and not with those brownish tinges to the wings, but pretty easy to recognize. It's one of the most common moths with this sort of elongated forewing shape that shows up at lights. The creosote moth, this is one of the most common moths we have in Arizona, especially if you're living near creosote plants, because I think it was April last month, I think I had well over 100 of these at my sheet on one night. So there can be a lot of them. They're also highly variable in color. So the one on the right's more heavily marked than the one on the left. Sometimes they're almost white. They're so palely marked, and other times they're much darker. So this is one that is kind of like, I kind of compare it to like the red-tailed hawk of the moth world, because there's so much variation between individuals in the species. And this thing gets its name because its caterpillars feed on creosote. Not all of them are earth tone. There's a whole group of geometers, or geos for short, that are called the emeralds, and they tend to be these beautiful pastel green colors that when they're on leaves, they are pretty well camouflaged. However, if they perch on your patio light by the wall or on the sheet, they really stand out because that's usually a paler color. But there are several species, about a dozen plus in this emerald group in Arizona. This wavy-lined emerald is one of the more common species. They get the name for those white lines on the green wings, kind of are wavy. There's another one, the southern emerald, where those lines are still green, white lines on a green background, but the lines are much straighter, and that's one way you can easily tell the two apart. The Noctuidae and the Erebidae that used to be combined, those are two large families, over 20,000 species each. This one was in the South Fork of Cave Creek Canyon in the Chiricahuas. It was drinking, getting salts from a puddle edge. The car had driven through the puddle, the waves went up, and the water dissolved salts that this thing will then slurp up. But this is a day flying moth. There's several species in the genus Olympia, but this is one of the more common ones. This is a species that feeds externally on cacti, especially cholla cactus. There are several moth caterpillars that feed on cactus in southern Arizona, but most of them are hidden. So they've buried into the stems, and they're feeding sort of from a concealed position. This one will feed on the outside, and you can find them. Adults are quite common. They have the bold white streak, kind of a brassy look to the forewings, but then bright orange hind wings. So a species that will show up in good numbers, usually during the monsoon season. Monsoon season is the best time of year for moths, but it's, you can find stuff almost every month of the year in southern Arizona. The black witch, this is one of the larger moths, if not the largest ones we have here. This is a female because it's got that bold white line bisecting the forewings. The males are basically similar, except they don't have that white stripe. These are moths that really don't have, they're tropical. They don't really have much of a cold tolerance. And so every year they tend to wander up from Mexico, or I don't want to say migrate. I think that's putting too fine a point on it, but they can be in town. They can be, these things have made it all the way to southern Canada from Mexico. So they're strong flyers. We typically see, you can start to see them now, actually. They can start to show up just about any time, but they seem to increase in their abundance as the season goes on. And then once we get into, say November, they usually kind of drop out because it starts to get cold then, and they're not very cold adapted. But you can see how big they are. People often mistake them for bats because they fly quite fast. But truly impressive moths, and like I said, black witch is a great name, even though should be probably the brown witch. That doesn't give quite the same cachet as black witch does. There is a moth that lives in South America called the white witch. That's the one that's got a wingspan of about 11 inches. Really impressive moth. This one's quite a bit smaller, but you can still see it's good size. The tiger moths, I showed one early on. These are kind of the honorary butterflies of the moth world because they often are brightly colored. Those colors signify that they're unpalatable because they, so some of them, like there's a moth, beautiful sort of pink and white and black moth called the ornate Bella moth. It feeds on rattlebox, plants in the genus Crotalaria, and those are toxic. So it's doing sort of the same thing a monarch butterfly does, feeding on toxic plants and then sequestering those toxins in their tissue as a defense against predators. So some of them do that, but many of them are actually able to make their own toxins from precursors they ingest in their food plants. So many of the tiger moths are brightly colored. Not all of them, but many of them are. This one, we did a BioBlitz actually at Agua Caliente Park, because I also work for Pima County Natural Resources. Agua Caliente is on the far northeast side, just below the Catalinas. And we did a BioBlitz there, and we had one of these show up, which was a good find. The veined tenuca, this was again showing those feathery antennae. I showed this guy before. This is a moth that will come to lights, but also shows up on flowers during the daytime. Like in the late summer, early fall, it really likes desert broom and rabbit brush flowers. So when those are in flower, you often get a lot of these. But they have, the orange head, the smoky gray wings with blue metallic highlights on them, quite distinctive. The veined part of the name comes from the pale stripes kind of follow the veins in the wings. The northern flag moth, this is, I don't know, I think this is one of those moths, if you see it and are not impressed, you clearly have no soul, because these things are just fantastic. This is the largest hawk moth in North America, and we get it in Arizona. Caterpillars feed on Brickhelia, which is a little sort of like subshrub. Anyway, this is the male, and we know it's a male because it's got largely white hind wings. The female hind wings are largely orange in color. And to give you, this thing's got about a 3-inch wingspan, which I know in the grand scheme of things, that's not huge. But, if you start looking at a few micros, this thing is the size of a blue whale after a while. And so this is, a beautiful, I don't know where the flag part of the name comes from, But there's a whole bunch of close relatives of this thing that are in the tropics. And they're all basically variations on the black and white theme of the forewings and then the brightly colored hindwings. If you ever see, they're not rare, but they're not common either. At least that's my experience. But if you ever get a chance to see one, hopefully it will make your day. So at the end here, if you wanted to get interested in moss, it's really simple. All you really need to do, as I've alluded to many times, is just turn on your patio light and see what comes in. Now, just about any sort of light will work. A fluorescent bulb, LED bulb, a black light bulb, which actually gives off that sort of purplish light. Those will all work just fine. The only ones that don't really work are those sort of yellowish anti-bug lights. Not surprisingly, the anti-bug lights are not very good at attracting insects. You can just, flip the switch, put the light in, flip the switch and see what shows up. And that can be, a lot of fun. Just, see how things change during the course of the night, or change from one month to another, or one season to another. And you can use things like iNaturalist, which is an app you can download to your smartphone or to your tablet, and it will help you identify these things. You don't even have to have a field guide if you don't want one. So I do that a lot at my house, but if I'm going to, like the Sabino Canyon and the Mason Center, those trips coming up, this is kind of the setup. So basically tie some parachute cord between two trees, take a white cotton sheet and attach it to the line with clothespins. I have, there's an inverter, power inverter down here, and a battery, like a motorcycle battery here. I basically connect the inverter to the battery and then plug in the light into the inverter, and that's basically a mini generator. I know friends who take generators out. Those are, they'll last a long time, but they're also kind of noisy. And one of the things I really like is to be out at, this was in Madera Canyon, but to be out somewhere at night and it's quiet and you're listening to owls and nightjars and these insects are showing up, it makes for a really nice experience. But a lot of people use little, go to Home Depot or wherever, buy a little generator. And then, so either way, if you wanted to do that, and that's basically, you just turn the light on, and this is very high intensity activity. You can drink beer while you do it. You can drink wine while you do it. You can have dinner while you do it. You're basically affixed to a spot. And so, that's all you need. That's all you need to do, really. It's quite simple. And if, like I said, if you don't want to do any of this, which I understand, just turn your lights on and see what shows up. And this next slide. This was a Bruce Walsh photo at Peña Blanca Canyon. This is a couple decades ago, maybe not quite that long ago, but anyway, it shows you what it can be like. And so we have several of the Sphinx moths. We have several of those wild silk moths. So here's these are those Western imperial moths I showed you the picture of. Here's that splendid royal moth right here. These are Sphinx moths. Here's another royal moth. So this is what it can be like, and it's quite fantastic. So got 5 minutes for questions. That's the last slide. So let me stop sharing the screen. I see there's some stuff in the chat. Let's see what we got. Thank you all, by the way, very much for attending this. Tina says some birds eat moths also. Absolutely right. In fact, you made me think of a good point. So I will run the light at my house. It just goes into the fixture in the wall 3 or 4 nights a week, but then I turn it off because the birds learned very quickly, hey, there's a buffet over here. You can eat as much as you want. And, I feel very guilty about attracting things to their slaughter. So a way you can avoid that is just like, check it one last time, like before you go to sleep, and then turn it off. Then you don't have to worry about that. But Well, if you run it, you don't get up, like you oversleep a little bit, which is fine. Sleep is important. And you get out there, I mean, you're going to eat some moss. And that's why, I'll do it for a couple of days and then not do it for a couple of days and then, start it up again. Just to break, you don't want to be too predictable because the birds will figure it out. And another thing, I didn't mention this. Another way you can do it, if you want to see what shows up through the night, plus get sleep, is you can go to like a Target and get one of those little mesh clothes hampers, and you take egg crates. When you get your dozen eggs, they come in those little cardboard things or styrofoam things. You can pull, rip them in half, put those in your clothes hamper, because that will give the moths that are attracted to your light, that'll give them a place to hide. And then you basically can hang that over with the straps that come with it, hang it over your light, leave your light on all night, and get sleep. So that's another option. Sleep is a good thing. A lot of times I probably don't get as much as I should, but hey, if there's good moths showing up, why leave, right? If you're somewhere and there's good birds like flame-colored tanagers and barrel-line hummingbirds and everything else showing up, you're not going to say, oh, I need to get sleep and leave, right? You're going to hang in there as long as you can. Tina asks, are there moths in Antarctica? The answer is no on that. Very few. I know there's some true flies there, but there are not any moths there. So Karen asks, I've also heard that you can tell the difference between moths and butterflies by looking at how they hold their wings while they're resting. Out flat versus up together. True. Not 100%, because there are some moths that will rest with their wings folded like most butterflies do. However, that is another pretty good general rule. But there are some moths that will rest with their wings folded. So it's not 100%, but it's not a bad one. Yeah, and like Joan said, there are the opposites also too, where sometimes there's some butterflies that rest with their wings out wide. Because it's nature, right? Nature likes chaos. We like very nice categories for everything. And then we find that this is a brilliant category. I'm glad I came up with it. And then you find there's 5,000 exceptions, and all of a sudden your category is not so good. So Carl asks, would you please provide a few links of websites that can help us identify moths we have at our home here in Tucson? I think, yes. You can Google Moth Photographers Group or MPG. Don't Google MPG because you'll probably get a car back, or it might be for a car repair place. But Moth Photographers Group, it's out of the University of Mississippi. That's who hosts it. And it has basically a archive of photos, both of pin specimens, but also of live adults. And I usually use the live adults part. And you can go, when you have, like, they'll have the tab called plates. You click on that and you'll get a list of all the families. And if like there's a certain family you can look at, if you think I think it's in this family, look at that. And then you can specialize your search by the region you're in. And you can put in Arizona for that. It's up above the list of families, and that will help. However, there are a lot of moths that have not been photographed, or at least not been archived on the Moth Photographers Group. But it is a very good starting point. Another is the bugguide.net, which is a great site for identifying all insects. Again, those are both, especially Bug Guide, are community science sort of things. And I have been working in sort of fits and starts on a field guide to the moths of Arizona. And a good chunk of it is done. And the problem is the big families are not done, and they're going to take a lot of time. And so the reason why I wanted to put it together was kind of what you're hinting at. There's no field guide right now for Arizona. There's a book, The Moths of Western North America, by some very good lepidopterists. It's a great book, but it's mostly pinned specimen, and it does not really a field guide. So I would spend, you go out, do one night of black lighting, and you have all these photos you want to identify. 7 months later, you're still identifying those, and there's been 15 more black light nights since then. And so, the number of photos that are unidentified just kind of increases and increases. So I got tired of that, and I talked to Bruce Walsh, and I said, I want to work on a field guide for the Moths of Arizona. He said, that's great, you should do it. And then he changed his email address. No, he didn't. I just made that part up. And I realized very quickly why no one had done it. There's a lot of species out there, and that, even if you take all the micros out, there's a lot of species out there. So it's a very long-winded way for just be patient, identify the ones you can. The bigger and the more colorful ones are often the easiest ones to identify. At least there'll be typically more photos of those available for you to identify. But Moth Photographers Group is probably the best. Bug Guide's not bad either. So Gabrielle says feathery antenna indicate a male. Not necessarily. In some species, the males have the feathery antenna and the females have like thread-like antenna. On other species, both sexes have feathery antenna, but in the males, they're more developed. So if they're really obvious feathery antenna, very likely to be males. Thank you, Taylor, for the info about the Mason Center on Saturday night. That's fantastic. It should be fun. And the fun thing about this is every night you do this is kind of like Christmas, because you never know what, or like Forrest Gump, right? Life is like a box of chocolates. You just never know what you're going to get. Some nights are just off the hook. Other nights you're like, was there some sort of convention going on this evening? Where did all the moths go? And you just never know. That's just, the part of it. It's no different from birding. Some days are just fantastic, and others you'll be like somewhere like, are there any birds left in this canyon at all? And you don't see them. So Curtis asks, have you or others noticed a decline in moth abundance over the last couple of decades? I've seen Dan Jansen in Costa Rica posting photos showing big declines over the years, a worrisome trend. Excellent question, and the answer is yes. The number of moths is down substantially, and that's kind of why I said, when I showed that last photo of it being, a couple of decades ago, because if you went down now, you probably wouldn't get that diversity. A lot of different things going on out there. It's hard. I mean, there's not one factor leading to all of it. Habitat loss, invasive species, pesticides, changing climate. All of that stuff is coming into play. And I agree with you that it's a worrisome trend, especially when it's being quite noticeable even in areas that are relatively pristine, that have not been heavily developed, like in places in Costa Rica. So yeah, it's a very, and even let's say you sat, okay, let's just say you didn't like moths and somehow signed up for this by mistake. You thought it said months or something like that, and you said, oh, it would be fun. And you sort of didn't gain much of an appreciation for moths. Well, think about how important they are to other animals. Bats feed heavily on moths. Birds, think of, when you watch that yellow warbler flitting around through the cottonwood tree, think of how many caterpillars it's picking off every single day and feeding to its young, or eating, the parents eat them themselves. So this is without a doubt going to have a severe impact on other animals at some point down the road. And, I've seen statistics that over 50% of the birds of North America are declining. Again, it's a combination of factors, I have no doubt. But at the same time, I wonder, like with swallows and flycatchers and warblers and vireos and kinglets and chickadees, if how much of this decline is related to the decline in insects. And I don't know if, I would imagine people are trying to look into it, but I haven't seen any information that shows any sort of connection, but there has to be one. There's just too many birds that eat insects. And again, not all of them are eating moss, but many of them are eating caterpillars of moss. Oh, so Chris asks, how's the book coming along? Oh, you're a funny guy, Chris. I haven't done much on it lately. Life happens. I get pretty busy doing stuff with the county, with my own business, and so I just don't have as much time as I would like. So it's kind of in it's in diapause at the moment, to use an insect term. It's in diapause at the moment. Just waiting until I get some time to tackle it again. But it's definitely, I want to get it done. But here's the thing, there's another thing. So I go down, you go down these rabbit holes, you say, okay, I see this thing. Okay, this is where the months where it's found. You type up a description, you're like, okay, that looks okay. Then you get to the next one that looks almost exactly like the one that came before it. And then you end up like you're looking like this to see if you can notice any differences. And these bigger families have a lot of species in it, and a lot of them look quite similar to each other. So like the sphinx moths are done, the silk moths are done, the lasiocampids are done. A lot of the things are done, but the big roadblock is those two roadblocks, actually, speed bumps, not roadblocks, speed bumps. Those mega diverse families, and then all the micros. So that's just great. And Chris also, I have a Samsung Galaxy phone that I take, and a lot of the pictures were taken with my phone. I also have a Canon macro lens. However, nowadays, this phone is probably a year and a half old. The camera is exquisite. So in most cases, I don't even take my other camera with me anymore. I'll just use my cell phone and take pictures. So I'm glad you put that in, Chris. And the newer edition of smartphones have really good cameras on them. Well, I think. Oh, so Karen asked a question. Are there still people trapping moss for commercial purposes? The short answer is yes. It's not as much of a deal as it used to be, because now there are places in the world like Madagascar, for example, where they have these sort of yellowish silk moths that have like these really long, they're actually beautiful insects. Well, they do that. They'll take some females, allow them to lay eggs, release the female, and they're basically farming the moss. And the reason for that is to then be able to sell them to like butterfly houses or collectors. So some of the pressure in some situations has been taken off of wild populations, but there is still some of that going on. In fact, you can go like on National Forest Service land, for example, you can go there with, and collect as many insects as you want, as long as you say it's for your own personal collection. If you're going to sell them, then you have to get a permit. And humans being humans, we all know where that's going to go, right? I mean, there's going to be people out there selling them, but they're saying, not that anybody's really looking, but if they get caught, they're going to say, "Oh, this is my own collection." So it still does happen to a degree, but I think it's not. I think it's better than it was historically. All right, I will finally stop talking. Thank you all so very much. Thank you again, Taylor. Really appreciate you hosting the festivities. We will see you hopefully on Saturday night at the Mason Center. We'll see what we get. And then if you can't make that one, maybe we'll see you during the festival out at Sabino Canyon. It'll be fun. So thank you, everyone. Hope you like moss. Thank you again, Taylor. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really enjoyed that. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a wonderful day.